The alarm inside my training pod screamed before I even opened my eyes, and I knew something had already gone wrong. My name is Voss, and I am a second-year cadet at the Interspecies Survival Academy, a place built to test young officers from a dozen different worlds under conditions that could kill any one of us if we were careless. When the drop hatch beneath my seat opened without warning and dumped me onto hard, wet ground, I understood this was not a normal lesson. There was no briefing, no calm instructor voice explaining the rules, just cold air, a heavy sky, and the sound of my 3 squad mates crashing down around me like falling rocks. I hit the mud shoulder first and rolled, my breathing tubes rattling with the impact. Around me, the forest was thick and dark, full of unfamiliar smells and unfamiliar sounds. Somewhere above the tree line, our dropship was already pulling away, its engines fading into the clouds. We were alone. A voice crackled through my ear implant, sharp and unemotional. It was Instructor Halden, the officer in charge of our unit. "Cadets, this is your unannounced field exercise. You have been placed in a low-technology environment. Your task is simple. Build a shelter that can protect your squad from the coming storm. You have 6 hours. No tools, no equipment, no technology beyond what nature provides. Fail, and you will experience the storm without protection. Good luck." The transmission cut out before I could ask a single question. Typical of Halden. He believed cadets learned faster when they were afraid. I pushed myself up onto my feet and looked around. My 3 squad mates were doing the same, each of them covered in mud, each of them clearly furious. There was Rekka, a sharp-clawed hunter species built for combat and precision work. There was Dorn, whose body produced strange chemical secretions used for construction on his homeworld, and there was Iala, a small floating species used to zero-gravity environments, whose limbs moved strangely on solid ground, like she was still trying to swim through the air. And then there was the human. His name was Daniel Cole, the only human cadet in our unit, and honestly, the only human I had ever spoken to in real life. He was quiet most of the time, rarely spoke unless someone asked him something directly, and never bragged about anything. Compared to the rest of us, he looked almost fragile. No claws, no natural armor, no special adaptation that I could see. Just soft skin, 2 arms, 2 legs, and eyes that looked a little too calm for someone who had just been dropped into a storm zone with no equipment. While the rest of us were already shouting over each other, arguing about which direction to go and who should be in charge, Daniel walked a few steps away from the group, crouched down near the edge of a shallow stream, and picked up a handful of dark, wet earth. He rubbed it between his fingers slowly, like he was testing the texture of fabric. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to do, while the sky above us was already turning a deep, threatening gray. Rekka snapped first, the way she always did. She was proud of her claws, sharp enough to cut through solid wood in one strike, and she seemed to believe this challenge would be easy for someone with natural weapons like hers. "This will take me minutes," she said, flexing her clawed fingers. "Watch and learn." She marched toward the nearest tree and began slicing into it with quick, confident strikes. Bark flew in every direction. For a moment, it looked like she might actually succeed, cutting branches down with impressive speed. But when she tried to shape the wood into something useful, something that could actually stand as a wall, her claws were too sharp for the job. Instead of shaping the wood, she kept splitting it apart into useless splinters. She growled in frustration, tried again and again, only to end up with a pile of broken branches and no real progress. Dorn was next. His people were known across our sector for their unique ability to secrete a thick, resin-like substance from special glands in their forearms, a material that hardened almost instantly and was often used in construction back on his homeworld. He seemed certain this exercise would be effortless. "Simple," he muttered, holding his arms toward a cluster of fallen branches. "Watch how real builders work." He pressed his arms against the wood, and thick yellow liquid oozed out, covering the branches in a shiny coat. For a few seconds it seemed to be working. Then the liquid began to react with the wet soil beneath it, hissing and bubbling in a way that did not look safe at all. A thin cloud of smoke rose from the mixture, and Dorn jumped back with a surprised shout, waving his arms as if trying to shake off the smell. "That is not supposed to happen," he said, staring at his own hands like they had betrayed him. Iala, meanwhile, was struggling with something even more basic than construction. Her species had evolved in a floating environment, with almost no real concept of solid ground or gravity. Every step she took was slightly wrong, too light, too uncertain, as if she expected the ground to shift beneath her at any moment. When she tried to stack a few rocks to form a base for a wall, she misjudged the weight completely, and the whole pile toppled over the moment she let go. "I do not understand this planet," she said quietly, sitting back on the ground with a confused expression. "Everything falls the wrong way here." I almost laughed at their struggles, feeling a small sense of pride in my own species. Where I come from, we do a great deal of manual labor without machines, so I expected this exercise to be simple for me. I walked toward a patch of soil near the stream, confident that I would show them all how it was done. I grabbed a handful of mud, packed it firmly, and tried to build a small wall, the way I had seen builders do back home. Within minutes, my wall collapsed into a shapeless heap. I tried again, adjusting the mixture, adding more water, then less water, but nothing held together properly. My confidence disappeared quickly, replaced by the same frustration I saw on my squadmates' faces. It was somewhere in the middle of my third failed attempt that I noticed something strange. The quiet human squad member, Daniel, had not said a single word this entire time, while the rest of us were arguing, failing, and growing more frustrated by the second. He was simply working, calmly and steadily, without any hint of stress on his face. He had already gathered a small pile of sticks near the stream and was arranging them into a simple frame, tying them together using thin strips of bark he had peeled from a nearby tree. It looked almost too easy the way his fingers moved, like he had done this exact task 100 times before. I walked toward him, more out of curiosity than anything else, brushing mud off my hands. "What are you doing?" I asked, unable to hide the confusion in my voice. He glanced up at me, not with pride or arrogance, just a simple, calm look, like the question itself was unusual to him. "Building a frame first," he said. "You need something for the walls to hold on to, or the mud just falls apart. That is what happened to your wall, I think. No support underneath." I stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. It sounded so simple when he said it, almost embarrassingly obvious, yet none of us had thought of it. "You have done this before," I said, more of a statement than a question. Daniel shrugged, tying another stick into place with quick, practiced movements. "When I was a kid, my grandfather taught me how to build things like this," he said. "Not for survival training or anything like that, just because he thought it was a good skill to have. We did not have machines out where he lived. If you wanted something built, you built it yourself, with your hands." I found myself watching him a little longer than I intended to, trying to understand how someone from such a physically weak species, at least by our Academy's usual standards, could look so completely at ease with a task the rest of us, all supposedly stronger and better equipped by nature, were failing at without exception. Behind me, I could hear Rekka growling in frustration as she tried yet again to shape a piece of wood without shredding it apart. Dorn was scraping smoking resin off his arms with a worried expression, muttering something about needing new glands for this planet. Iala had given up on stacking rocks entirely and was now sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at the sky as if hoping the storm would simply skip over us out of pity. None of them seemed to notice Daniel at all, too focused on their own struggles to pay attention to the quiet human working steadily nearby. I looked back at him, at the simple wooden frame slowly taking shape beneath his hands, and felt a strange mixture of curiosity and unease settle into my chest. Something about this moment felt important, though I could not yet explain why. The wind was picking up. The gray sky above us had darkened further, and somewhere in the distance, low rumbles of thunder rolled across the hills. 6 hours did not sound like much time anymore. I turned my attention back to my own pile of failed mud walls, determined to figure out what I was doing wrong, unable to shake the feeling that the answer was standing quietly right beside me the entire time, working with calm, patient hands, saying very little, and somehow already ahead of every single one of us. The thunder grew louder, and with it, my patience for my own failures grew shorter. I stood over my third collapsed wall, mud clinging to my arms up to the elbow, and forced myself to think clearly instead of reacting out of frustration. Daniel's words kept repeating in my mind. You need something for the walls to hold on to, or the mud just falls apart. It sounded so simple, yet I had never considered it. On my homeworld, walls were built by machines that already understood these things, machines that mixed the right materials in the right amounts without anyone needing to think about it. I realized, standing there in the mud, that I had never actually built anything with my own hands in my entire life. I had only ever operated tools that built things for me. That thought unsettled me more than I expected. I turned to look at my squad mates, hoping to find comfort in shared struggle, but their situations had only grown worse. Rekka had abandoned her sharp claws entirely and was now attempting to break branches using her own body weight, throwing herself against a young tree over and over, trying to snap it in half. The tree bent under her weight, but refused to break, and after her fifth attempt, she stumbled backward into a puddle, covering herself in mud from head to foot. She sat there for a moment, breathing hard, before letting out a long, frustrated growl that echoed across the clearing. "This planet hates me," she muttered, pulling herself back onto her feet. Dorn was in an even stranger situation. After his first failed attempt with his resin glands, he had tried mixing his secretions with different materials, hoping to find a combination that would not react so violently with the wet soil. Instead, he had created a strange, sticky foam that clung to everything it touched, including his own hands. He was now attempting to pull his fingers apart, which had become stuck together in the process. "I believe I have made things worse," he said, holding up his gummed-together hands with a look of pure embarrassment. Ayala had given up on building entirely, and was instead trying to convince the rest of us that maybe we did not actually need a shelter at all. "Perhaps the storm will not be as bad as they say," she offered weakly, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. "Perhaps we could just wait it out somewhere open." None of us responded to that suggestion, mostly because none of us believed it either. I looked past my struggling squad mates, back toward Daniel, who was still working near the stream, and found myself walking toward him again, this time with a different question in mind. "Can you teach me?" I asked, standing awkwardly beside his half-built frame. I do not want to fail this exercise because I never thought to ask for help. Daniel looked up at me, and for a brief moment I expected him to laugh, or to point out how strange it was that I, someone from a species built for manual work, was asking a human for building advice. Instead, he simply nodded, as if the request made perfect sense to him. "Sure," he said, "it is not complicated once you understand the basic idea. Grab some of those long branches over there, the thinner ones, and I will show you how to tie them properly." For the first time since we had landed in this forest, I felt a small flicker of hope. Daniel explained the process patiently, without ever making me feel foolish for not already knowing it. He showed me how to select branches of similar length and thickness, how to lay them in a simple crossing pattern, and how to secure them together using thin strips of bark twisted tightly like rope. He explained that the frame needed to be strong enough to support weight, but flexible enough to bend slightly without snapping during strong wind. "Back home, we call this wattle," he said, tying another branch into place. "It is a very old method. People used it long before we had any advanced tools. Once the frame is built, you cover it with a mixture of mud and straw, called daub. That is the part everyone always messes up first, because they think more mud automatically means a stronger wall. It does not work that way. The mixture needs the right balance, or it either crumbles apart or takes forever to dry properly." I listened closely, trying to memorize every detail, feeling both amazed and slightly embarrassed that I had not thought of any of this myself. Back on my world, structures were built using powerful machines that mixed materials with mathematical precision, controlled by computers that calculated exact ratios down to the smallest measurement. I had studied those machines in school. I had never once needed to understand the actual reason behind the ratios, because the machines already knew. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to understand the reasoning behind every single step, not because a machine had once told him, but because he had learned it directly, through practice and patience, likely passed down from someone before him who had also learned it the same way. As we worked together on the frame, I noticed something else. Daniel never once mentioned how badly the rest of us were struggling. He did not comment on Rekka's aggressive attempts to break trees with her own body, or Dorn's sticky, foam-covered hands, or Iyala's quiet suggestion that maybe we simply skip the entire exercise. He focused entirely on the task in front of him, offering help when asked, without ever making anyone feel small for needing it. It made me curious about something. "Are you not frustrated at all?" I asked him at one point, tying a fresh branch into place beside his. "Everyone else is falling apart, literally and otherwise, and you are just calmly building like none of this bothers you." Daniel paused for a moment, considering the question carefully before answering. "I think everyone learns differently," he said. "Back home, we do not really have creatures with claws sharp enough to cut wood instantly, or bodies that make construction resin, or the ability to float through the air without much effort. Humans are kind of slow and weak compared to a lot of other species out here, from what I understand. So we had to figure out other ways to get things done, mostly by using our hands directly and by learning from people who came before us." That was such a simple answer, yet it stayed with me long after he said it. By the time our frame was finished, thick clouds had completely swallowed the sky, and the wind had grown strong enough to shake the branches of the surrounding trees. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, closer than it had been before. "We do not have much time left," Daniel said, glancing upward with a slightly more serious expression than before. "We need to start on the mud walls now, or we will not finish in time." I nodded, feeling a small knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. 6 hours had sounded like plenty of time earlier, back when the sky had still been calm. Now, with the storm clearly approaching faster than expected, it felt like almost no time at all. Daniel knelt beside the stream, scooping up handfuls of dark, wet soil and testing the texture between his fingers, exactly the way he had at the very beginning of the exercise. This time, I understood what he was doing. "You are checking how much water is in it," I said, more confident this time. "Exactly," he said, nodding with a small smile. "Too much water, and it will not hold its shape. Too little, and it will crack apart once it dries. It needs to feel almost like thick dough, sticky, but firm enough to hold together when you press it." He mixed in a handful of dried grass he had collected earlier, working it through the mud with steady hands. "The grass helps hold everything together," he explained. "Without it, the mud alone tends to crack as it dries." This is basically the same idea people used thousands of years ago to build actual houses, long before anyone had modern tools. It is simple, but it works, as long as you are patient and careful about it. We began pressing the thick mixture onto the wooden frame together, layer by layer, building up the walls slowly. My earlier attempts had failed because I had tried to build the entire wall in one single layer, expecting it to hold immediately. Daniel showed me that patience mattered more than speed, that each layer needed a few minutes to firm up slightly before adding the next one on top. While we worked, I could hear my squad mates in the background, still struggling in their own ways, though their voices had grown quieter, replaced by the sound of wind rushing faster through the trees. At one point, Rekka wandered closer to where Daniel and I were working, her fur soaked with mud and rain, her earlier confidence completely gone. She watched us for a long moment without saying anything, before finally speaking, her voice softer than I had ever heard it before. "How are you both making that look so easy?" she asked, staring at the slowly rising mud wall with something close to disbelief. Daniel looked up at her, offering the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. "It is not really easy," he said honestly. "I just messed up a lot when I was younger learning how to do it. Eventually, you figure out what works and what does not. Want to help? There is still a lot of wall left to finish, and extra hands would make this faster. For a moment, Rekka simply stared at him, clearly surprised by the offer. Then, slowly, she nodded and knelt down beside us, her sharp claws now being used gently to press mud into place instead of tearing through wood. I glanced up at the darkening sky, watching thick clouds roll ever closer, and felt something shift inside me. This exercise had started with each of us relying entirely on our own natural strengths. Each of us, certain our own biology made this task easy. Instead, it was turning into something none of us had expected, a lesson that had very little to do with claws, or chemical glands, or floating limbs, and everything to do with patience, teamwork, and a willingness to actually learn from someone else, even someone who looked far weaker than the rest of us on the surface. Rain began falling in scattered drops, cold against my skin, and I knew we no longer had the luxury of moving slowly. Rekka worked beside us now, her claws gently pressing mud into the gaps between branches, following the pattern Daniel had shown us without complaint. It was strange to see her so quiet, so focused, when only an hour earlier she had been throwing her entire body against a tree in frustration. I wondered if she felt the same thing I did, a kind of humbling realization that our natural strengths, the things we had always been told made us superior builders, fighters, or survivors, meant very little without the patience and knowledge to use them properly. Dorn approached next, his hands finally free of the sticky foam after scrubbing them clean in the stream. He looked at our rising wall, then at his own smoking pile of ruined branches nearby, and let out a long, tired sigh. "May I help as well?" he asked quietly, his earlier confidence completely gone. "I do not think my own methods are going to work here." Daniel nodded without hesitation, waving him closer. "Of course," he said. "Grab some of that dried grass over there and start mixing it into the mud like we are doing. The more hands we have, the faster this goes, and the storm is not waiting for us." I found myself surprised by how easily Daniel welcomed each of them into the work, without ever making them feel foolish for needing help. He did not remind Rekka of her earlier failed attempts, or mention Dorn's sticky hands, or point out that Iala had spent the last hour suggesting we simply give up. He simply handed them tasks, explained what needed to be done, and trusted that they would figure out the rest through practice, exactly the way he had learned it himself. Only Iala remained apart from the group, sitting near the edge of the clearing, wrapping her thin arms around her knees, watching the rest of us work with a distant, uncertain expression. I walked over to her, mud still clinging to my hands from the wall we were building. "You should come help," I said. "We need everyone if we want to finish before the storm gets worse." Ayala shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I do not understand this planet," she said quietly. "Everything about the way things move here confuses me. I keep making mistakes, and every mistake makes me feel further behind. It feels pointless to keep trying." I understood her frustration more than she probably realized. I had felt the exact same way only an hour earlier, standing over my own collapsed walls, convinced that failure meant something deeper than simply needing more practice. "It is not pointless," I said, kneeling down beside her. I felt exactly the same way, and then Daniel showed me something simple I had never thought of before. None of us knew how to do this properly at first. Not even him, from what he told me. He said he messed up a lot when he was younger too. Iala looked up at me, uncertain. "He seems so calm about all of it," she said, "like none of this bothers him at all." "I do not think it is that nothing bothers him," I said, thinking back to our earlier conversation. "I think it is that he understands failing is just part of learning something new. His people never had natural tools built into their bodies, so they had to learn everything the hard way, through mistakes, over and over, until they figured it out. Maybe that is exactly why he is so calm about it now. He has already failed at this more times than any of us." Iala considered this for a long moment, watching Daniel work steadily beside Rekka and Dorn, patiently guiding their hands whenever they pressed the mud too thick or too thin. Slowly, she pushed herself up onto her feet and walked closer to the group, her step still slightly unsteady on the solid ground, but more determined than before. "Show me what to do," she said quietly, kneeling down beside Dorn. Daniel looked over, offering her the same welcoming nod he had given the others. "Grab a handful of mud right there," he said gently. "Do not worry about doing it perfectly the first time. Just get a feel for how it moves in your hands. We will fix any mistakes as we go." For the first time since we had landed in this storm-battered clearing, all 5 of us were working together, side by side, toward the same goal. The rain grew heavier as the hours passed, and the wind picked up sharply, bending the trees around us at strange angles. Despite the worsening weather, our progress continued steadily. The wooden frame Daniel and I had built earlier now held thick, solid walls of packed mud and straw, rising higher with every layer we added. It was far from perfect, uneven in places, thicker on one side than the other, but it stood firm against the wind in a way none of our earlier individual attempts ever had. At one point, while pressing a fresh layer of mud into place, Dorn asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. "Why does this work so much better than what I tried earlier?" he asked, glancing at his own hands, no longer covered in the strange, sticky foam from before. "My resin is supposed to be one of the strongest building materials on my homeworld. It should have worked instantly." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, continuing to press mud into the wall as he spoke. "I think the problem is not that your resin is weak," he said. "I think the problem is that it was designed for your planet's environment, not this one. Materials react differently depending on moisture, temperature, even the type of soil. Back home, we had thousands of years to figure out which methods worked in which conditions, through nothing but trial and error, because we never had a built-in solution that worked everywhere automatically. Your body gave you an incredible tool, but only for the environment it evolved in. My species never got that advantage, so we learned to read the environment itself instead, and adjust our methods based on what we find, rather than relying on one single fixed solution." Dorn absorbed this explanation slowly, nodding as if a difficult puzzle was finally beginning to make sense to him. "That is why you did not panic when your first frame attempt did not immediately work," he said. Daniel smiled slightly, the first real smile I had seen from him all day. "Exactly," he said. "Panicking never fixes anything. It just wastes time you do not have." Rekka, listening nearby, let out a short, quiet laugh, the first sound of genuine humor she had made since the exercise began. "I definitely panicked earlier," she admitted, glancing at the pile of splintered branches she had left scattered across the clearing. "I threw my entire body against a tree 5 times before giving up." "I saw that," Daniel said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I was actually a little worried you might hurt yourself." The group shared a brief, quiet laugh together, a small moment of lightness amid the growing storm, and I found myself feeling something unexpected. Despite the mud, the rain, and the constant threat of the approaching weather, I felt more connected to my squad mates in that single moment than I had during any of our earlier lessons back at the academy. As the walls grew taller, Daniel guided us through the next stage of construction, carefully explaining how to leave a small opening near the top of the structure for airflow, and how to angle the roof slightly so that rainwater would run off instead of pooling on top and eventually collapsing the entire structure. "You always need to think about where the water goes," he explained, demonstrating the correct angle with a long, flat piece of bark. "If you do not plan for that, the roof will fail eventually, even if the walls are strong." I found myself watching him closely during every step, memorizing not just his instructions, but the calm, steady way he approached every single decision. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary panic, only a clear, patient focus on solving one small problem at a time. By the time the roof frame was finally set into place, thunder rolled directly overhead, loud enough to make all of us flinch. The storm was arriving faster than any of us had expected. "We need to hurry," Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the urgency in his words. "The final layer of daub needs a little time to firm up before the rain hits it directly, or it will wash away before it has a chance to properly set. We worked faster then, pressing the final layers of mud and straw onto the roof and walls, working almost entirely in silence, focused completely on finishing before the storm truly broke overhead. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance, followed a few seconds later by a deep, rolling boom of thunder that echoed across the clearing. Despite the mounting pressure, I noticed something remarkable. None of us were arguing anymore. None of us were blaming our own biology or complaining about the unfairness of the exercise. We were simply working, together, toward a single shared goal, guided by the quiet human who had somehow, without ever raising his voice or bragging about his skill, become the one person all of us trusted most in that moment. As the first heavy sheets of rain began sweeping across the clearing, our small mud hut stood finished, imperfect in places, uneven along one edge, but solid and clearly capable of protecting all 5 of us from the storm that was now fully upon us. "Get inside," Daniel said, waving us toward the narrow entrance he had left near the front of the structure. "We can check for any weak spots once we are out of the rain." One by one, we ducked through the low opening and into the small, dim space inside. It smelled of wet earth and fresh straw, but it was dry and completely shielded from the wind roaring outside. I sat down against the curved mud wall, breathing hard, feeling the exhaustion of the past several hours settle into my limbs. Across from me, Rekka, Dorn, and Iyala settled into their own spots, each of them looking around at the walls we had built together with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. Daniel was the last one inside, ducking through the narrow entrance and pulling a woven mat of dried grass across the opening to block most of the wind and rain. He sat down near the entrance, glancing around at the 4 of us with a small, satisfied nod. "Not bad for a first try," he said quietly. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling across the clearing, rain hammering against the curved mud roof above us. But inside, in the dim, dry space we had built together with nothing but our own hands, patience, and the quiet guidance of a single human cadet, all of us felt something that none of our natural abilities had been able to provide on their own. We felt safe. The storm did not weaken quickly, and for a long while none of us spoke, listening instead to the wind howling past our small shelter, testing every seam and joint we had built with our own hands only hours earlier. I sat with my back pressed against the curved mud wall, feeling the slight vibration of thunder rolling somewhere overhead, and found myself thinking about everything that had happened since we first landed in this forest. Only a few hours ago, each of us had believed our natural advantages, claws, chemical glands, effortless flight, would make this exercise simple. Instead, every single one of us had failed completely, until a quiet human with none of those advantages had shown us a better way forward. Rekka broke the silence first, her voice softer than her usual confident tone. "I have never had to ask anyone for help like that before," she admitted, staring down at her claws, now caked in dried mud instead of splinters. "Back home, everyone assumes because of how my body is built, I should already know how to handle physical tasks. It never occurred to me that I might need to learn something instead of simply doing it naturally." Dorn nodded in agreement, examining his own hands, still slightly stained from his earlier chemical mishap. "Same for me," he said. "My people are known throughout this sector for our construction abilities. I assumed that reputation meant I did not need to actually think carefully about how or why our methods worked. I just expected them to work everywhere, automatically." Iyala, sitting near the back of the small shelter, wrapped her arms around her knees, staring at the mud wall closest to her with a thoughtful expression. "I think I assumed my body's advantages. This exercise would still be difficult for me because our environment back home is so different," she said. "I never once thought that maybe the difficulty had less to do with which body I had, and more to do with whether I was willing to slow down and actually learn something new." I found myself nodding along with each of their reflections, recognizing pieces of my own thoughts in what they were saying. Throughout my entire life, I had been taught that my species' natural strength for manual labor made physical tasks like this one easy for us. I had never once considered that maybe true skill required more than just natural ability. It required patience, careful observation, and a willingness to fail repeatedly until you understood not just what to do, but why it worked. Daniel, sitting near the entrance of our shelter, listened quietly to each of us, without interrupting, occasionally nodding along, but mostly letting us work through our own thoughts without adding his own opinion. Eventually, I turned toward him directly, unable to hold back the question that had been building in my mind since we first began building the frame together. "Why did you not tell us all of this from the very beginning?" I asked. "You could have explained everything before we all wasted so much time failing on our own first." Daniel considered the question carefully, the same thoughtful expression he always wore whenever someone asked him something important. "I thought about it," he admitted. "But honestly, I think you all needed to fail first, before any of my advice would have actually made sense to you. If I had just walked up and told everyone the secret to building a mud wall right at the very start, you probably would have listened politely, then gone right back to relying on your natural abilities anyway, because that is what you already trusted. Sometimes people only really learn something new once they have already tried the old way and watched it fail with their own eyes." I thought about that for a long moment, realizing he was right. If Daniel had simply explained the wattle and daub method to us at the very beginning, before any of us had struggled, I doubted any of us would have taken it as seriously as we eventually did. "You learned all of this from your grandfather?" I asked, remembering what he had told me earlier by the stream. Daniel nodded, a small, distant smile crossing his face. "Yes," he said. "He grew up somewhere with very little modern technology, and he always believed that knowing how to build things with your own hands was a skill everyone should have, no matter how advanced the world around you becomes. He used to say that machines can fail, or run out of power, or simply not be available when you need them most, but the knowledge in your own hands and mind never runs out, as long as you remember it." "That is a wise way to think," Dorn said quietly. "I think humans had to think that way," Daniel said. "For most of our history, we did not have any built-in tools like the rest of you. No claws sharp enough to cut wood instantly, no chemical glands that create construction resin, no natural ability to float weightlessly through the air. Everything we needed, we had to build ourselves, using nothing but our hands, whatever materials we found around us, and knowledge passed down from people before us. I think that is probably why humans get along reasonably well in almost any environment we encounter, even ones we were never specifically designed for. We never had one single natural advantage to rely on, so we learned to adapt instead." I found this explanation fascinating and slightly humbling. My entire life, I had considered humans to be one of the physically weaker species in known space, lacking any single overwhelming natural advantage compared to species like mine, or Rekka's, or Dorn's. I had never once considered that this apparent weakness might actually be the reason humans adapted so easily to almost any situation they encountered. Outside, the storm continued rolling across the clearing, rain hammering steadily against our curved mud roof, wind occasionally shaking the entire structure with a sudden violent gust. Each time this happened, I felt a small flicker of worry, wondering if our hastily built shelter would actually hold against the full force of the storm. Daniel seemed to notice my nervousness, glancing toward the roof above us with a reassuring expression. "It should hold," he said calmly. "We packed the walls thick enough, and the roof has a good enough angle for the water to run off properly. The frame is sturdy. I have seen actual houses built this exact way survive storms much worse than this one." His confidence helped calm my nerves slightly, though I still flinched every time a particularly strong gust of wind rattled against the walls. As the hours passed, our conversation slowly shifted away from the exercise itself and toward broader questions about our different worlds, our different cultures, and the different ways each of our species approached challenges like the one we had just faced together. Rekka asked Daniel about human history, curious how a species without any single overwhelming natural advantage had managed to develop advanced technology at all. "I think it took us a lot longer than most other species you have probably studied," Daniel admitted. "We spent thousands of years relying entirely on manual labor, simple tools, and patient observation, long before we developed any of the advanced technology most of you associate with humans today. I think that slow, difficult process actually taught us something valuable, though. It taught us patience, and the importance of understanding the basic reasoning behind why something works, instead of simply relying on a tool or ability without understanding it at all. Dorn nodded thoughtfully, considering this explanation carefully. That would explain why you understood the reasoning behind the mud mixture so clearly, he said. The rest of us understood our own natural tools well enough, but none of us understood the actual science behind construction the way you clearly do. Daniel shrugged modestly, though I could tell he appreciated the observation. I do not think I am smarter than any of you, he said. I just had a different kind of education growing up, one that focused heavily on doing things directly with my own hands, rather than depending entirely on natural ability or built-in technology. I think every species probably has its own version of that kind of knowledge, passed down in ways that might not always be obvious to outsiders. Iala, listening quietly throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up again, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. "Do you think I could learn to build things properly, the way you do?" she asked, glancing down at her own thin, delicate limbs. "My body was built for a completely different environment. I always assumed that meant certain skills would simply be impossible for me." Daniel considered her question seriously before answering, meeting her eyes directly. "I do not think your body limits you nearly as much as you believe it does," he said. "You helped build half of that wall over there yourself, remember? It might take you longer to learn certain physical skills compared to someone naturally built for manual labor, but I do not think that means it is impossible. It just means you might need a little more patience, and probably a good teacher, the same as anyone else learning something new for the first time." Iala smiled slightly at this, glancing toward the section of wall she had personally helped construct earlier that day, a section that, despite a few uneven patches, had held firm against the storm, exactly like the rest of the structure. "I am proud of that wall," she admitted quietly. "You should be," Daniel said. "We all should be. None of us knew how to do this a few hours ago, and now look at what we built together." As the storm outside slowly began to weaken, its howling winds softening into a gentler, steady rainfall, I found myself looking around at my 3 squadmates, each of them covered in dried mud, each of them exhausted from hours of hard, unfamiliar labor, and each of them, in their own way, changed by the lesson we had just experienced together. I thought back to the beginning of the exercise, when each of us had been so certain our own natural abilities would make this task simple, only to discover, almost immediately, that raw natural talent meant very little without patience, careful observation, and a genuine willingness to learn something new from someone else, regardless of how physically weak that someone else might have initially appeared to be. Sitting there, listening to the gentle patter of rain against our sturdy little shelter, I realized something important. The true lesson of this exercise had very little to do with claws, chemical resin, or effortless flight. It had everything to do with humility, patience, and the quiet, steady wisdom of a human cadet who had never once bragged about his skill, had never once made any of us feel foolish for failing, and had simply, calmly, shown us all a better way forward, one careful, patient step at a time. By the time the storm finally passed, the sky outside had shifted from deep, threatening gray to a soft, pale color, the first hint of morning light breaking gently through thinning clouds. I woke to the sound of Instructor Halden's voice crackling through my ear implant, sharper and more alert than it had been the previous day. "Cadets, this is Instructor Halden. Exercise time has expired. Report your status immediately." I sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness of a long night spent sitting against a curved mud wall, and glanced around at my squadmates. Rekka was already awake, stretching her clawed arms carefully, mindful not to scratch the walls we had all worked so hard to build. Dorn sat quietly near the entrance, examining his hands, apparently checking to make sure no trace of sticky foam remained. Iala was curled near the back of the shelter, still half asleep, her thin limbs finally relaxed after a long night of unfamiliar physical labor. Daniel, was the first to respond to Halden's transmission, his voice calm and steady despite the early hour. "Instructor, this is Cadet Daniel Cole. Squad status, all 4 members present and accounted for. Shelter constructed and currently intact. Requesting instructions for exercise completion." There was a brief pause on the other end of the transmission, followed by the sound of movement, footsteps approaching from somewhere outside our shelter. A moment later, the woven mat covering our entrance was pulled aside, and pale morning light spilled into the small space, along with the tall, imposing figure of Instructor Halden himself, his expression unreadable as he examined the interior of our shelter. He said nothing for a long moment, simply studying the curved mud walls, the small ventilation opening near the roof, the neat, even layers of packed straw and earth that had somehow held firm against the entire force of the previous night's storm. "Step outside, cadets," he said finally, his voice giving away nothing about his opinion. One by one, we crawled out of the narrow entrance and into the cool morning air, blinking against the sudden brightness after a long night spent in the dim shelter. The clearing around us looked completely different in daylight, the ground still soaked from the storm, broken branches scattered everywhere from the powerful winds, fallen leaves plastered against every surface. And there, standing quietly beside our small mud hut, was clear evidence of everything we had gone through together. Instructor Halden walked a slow circle around our shelter, running one hand carefully along the outer wall, testing its strength, checking the angle of the roof, examining the small ventilation gap near the top. "This is remarkably well constructed," he said finally, turning back to face us. "Solid walls, proper drainage angle on the roof, ventilation placed correctly to prevent moisture buildup inside. I am impressed. Which of you designed this structure?" For a brief moment, nobody spoke. I glanced toward Daniel, half expecting him to step forward and take credit for the design that had clearly saved all of us from the storm. Instead, he remained quiet, glancing toward the rest of us instead. "It was a group effort," Rekka said finally, stepping forward slightly. "Daniel showed us the basic method, but all 4 of us built it together, once we understood what we were doing." Instructor Halden raised an eyebrow slightly, glancing toward Daniel with obvious curiosity. "Is that true, Cole?" he asked. "You taught the rest of your squad this construction method?" Daniel nodded simply, without any hint of pride in his voice. "Yes, sir," he said. "My grandfather taught me a similar method when I was young. Once I explained the basic idea, everyone else picked it up quickly enough. I did not build this shelter alone. Everyone contributed once they understood the process." Halden studied him for a long moment, then turned his attention toward the rest of the training grounds, where the true extent of our success became fully visible for the first time. Scattered across the wide, muddy clearing were the remains of the other squad's attempts at the same exercise, and none of them had fared nearly as well as ours. One shelter, built entirely from stacked rocks without any proper frame, had collapsed completely sometime during the night, leaving its unfortunate squad members exposed to the full force of the storm. Another attempt, built using some kind of woven plant material without any protective outer layer, had become completely soaked through, offering no real protection at all. A third shelter had been built too close to a low area of the clearing, and had simply flooded from rising water during the heaviest part of the storm. Every other squad in our training group had failed the exercise in one way or another, their shelters either collapsing entirely or offering such poor protection that their occupants had likely spent the entire night cold, wet, and miserable. Our small mud hut stood as the only fully successful structure in the entire clearing. Halden's expression shifted slightly as he took in the full scope of what he was seeing, with something close to genuine surprise crossing his usually unreadable face. "This is the only structure that survived the storm completely intact," he said, more to himself than to us. "Every other squad experienced significant failures." He turned back toward our small group, studying each of us carefully. "I want each of you to explain, in your own words, what you learned from this exercise," he said, "starting with you, Cadet Voss." I stepped forward slightly, gathering my thoughts before answering. I learned that natural ability alone means very little without patience and understanding, I said honestly. I assumed my species' natural strength would make this exercise simple, and instead, I failed completely on my own. It was only after Daniel explained the reasoning behind proper construction methods that I understood what I had been doing wrong. Halden nodded, turning his attention toward Rekka. I learned that my claws, while useful for many things, are not automatically useful for every situation, she said. I assumed my natural weapons made me perfectly suited for building, and I was wrong. I needed to slow down, watch, and learn a completely different approach. Dorn spoke next, his voice thoughtful. I learned that natural advantages designed for one environment do not always translate perfectly into a different environment, he said. My construction resin is highly effective on my homeworld, but it reacted poorly here. I needed to understand the actual reasoning behind construction methods, rather than relying entirely on my body's natural output. Ayala spoke last, her voice quiet but steady. I learned that just because a task seems difficult due to unfamiliar surroundings does not mean it is truly impossible, she said. I nearly gave up entirely, convinced my body simply was not suited for this kind of task. Instead, with patience and guidance, I helped build a section of that wall myself, and it held firm through the entire storm. Halden listened carefully to each response, nodding slowly, before finally turning his attention toward Daniel, who had remained quiet throughout the others' explanations. "And you, Cadet Cole," he said, "what did you learn from this exercise?" Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. "I learned that everyone has something valuable to contribute once they are given the chance to understand a problem properly," he said. "I did not build this shelter by myself." Rekka helped press mud into the walls even after her claws kept damaging the wood earlier. Dorn helped mix the straw into the mud, even after his resin reacted badly with the soil. Ayala helped build an entire section of wall, even after nearly giving up completely. I think the real lesson here is not that humans are somehow better at manual construction than everyone else. It is that every species brings something useful to a challenge like this, as long as everyone is willing to be patient and willing to actually listen to each other. Halden studied him for a long moment, something close to genuine respect crossing his usually stern features. "That is an unusually mature perspective for a second-year cadet," he said finally. He turned back toward the rest of us, his voice returning to its usual formal tone. "This exercise was designed to test more than simple survival skills," he explained. "It was designed to test whether cadets could recognize the limits of their own natural abilities, and whether they were willing to learn from unexpected sources when those limits became apparent. Every other squad in this training group relied entirely on their own species' natural strengths, and every other squad failed as a direct result. Your squad is the only one that succeeded, and the reason is clear. You were willing to set aside your own assumptions about natural advantage and learn a completely different approach from a squadmate whose species does not share your particular biological strengths." He paused, glancing once more toward our small mud hut, still standing firm despite the storm that had raged around it all night long. "Cadet Cole demonstrated leadership without ever claiming authority over the rest of you," he continued. "He shared his knowledge freely, without demanding credit, and the result speaks for itself. This is the kind of leadership the Academy hopes every cadet eventually learns to demonstrate, regardless of which species they come from." I glanced toward Daniel, expecting him to look proud of this recognition, but instead, he simply looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I just showed everyone something my grandfather taught me," he said quietly. "Anyone else in my position probably would have done the same thing." Halden shook his head slightly, a small, rare smile crossing his stern features. "Perhaps," he said, "but you were the one who actually did it." As Instructor Halden turned to address the rest of our training group, gathering everyone together to review the results of the exercise, I found myself looking once more at our small, imperfect mud hut, standing quietly amid the wreckage of every other squad's failed attempts. I thought back to the beginning of the exercise, to my own confidence that my species' natural strength would make this task simple, and to the humbling series of failures that followed almost immediately afterward. I thought about Rekka's claws, too sharp for the delicate work of shaping mud. I thought about Dorn's resin, reacting violently with unfamiliar soil. I thought about Iala's uncertainty on solid ground, so different from the weightless environment she had evolved for. And I thought about Daniel, quiet and unassuming, lacking any single overwhelming natural advantage, yet somehow more prepared for this challenge than any of us. Not because of anything built into his body, but because of patience, careful observation, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who had faced the exact same challenge long before advanced technology ever existed. I understood now why the Academy included cadets from every different species in mixed training squads, rather than allowing us to train separately among our own kind. It was not simply to teach us how to work alongside unfamiliar species. It was to teach us that true skill rarely comes from natural ability alone. It comes from patience, humility, and a genuine willingness to learn from anyone willing to teach, regardless of how physically different or seemingly weaker that person might initially appear. As our training group gathered to hear Instructor Halden's final assessment of the exercise, I glanced once more toward Daniel, standing quietly near the back of our small group, still just as unassuming as he had been the moment we first landed in this storm-battered clearing. I made a quiet promise to myself in that moment, one I intended to carry with me throughout the rest of my time at the Academy, and likely far beyond it. Never again would I underestimate the quiet cadet standing in the corner, the one without claws, or chemical glands, or effortless flight, the one who said very little, and never once bragged about anything. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room understands something the rest of us have not yet learned, something worth paying very close attention to, especially when the storm finally arrives, and only one shelter is left standing.